Welcome to The Last Generation, the podcast where lived experience meets lasting change. I'm your host, Donna Simmons, author of Ashes to Flame, Transforming Trauma into Purpose, also a survivor, advocate, and truth teller. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Last Generation with our final episode in the Parenting on Broken Ground series. This is part 3 in our series, and today we're talking about the collision zone that happens between biological parents and step-parents. If you're living in a blended family, you already know it's not just messy, it's emotional, it's triggering, and sometimes it feels impossible. Step-parents often feel invisible. Bio-parents often feel threatened. And the kids? They're caught right in the middle of it. And today we're going to unpack what's actually going on underneath those explosions, the role of egos, the wounded parts inside all of us, and how complex PTSD can get triggered in the middle of these conflicts. I'll also walk you through the internal family systems framework, which gives us a way to step out of reactivity and back into calm, self-led parenting. And I'll share some of my own stories because, listen, I'm not speaking from a textbook here. I've been in this, I've lived it, and I still am. And I know the way it can feel like a war that you never signed up for. But I also know that healing is possible. Let's dive in, but first, let's listen to a clip from a conversation with my husband on what our job as parents and step-parents is versus what our own ego may tell us we need for edification. In order to be able to be caring individuals and really contribute to the best of their ability to the communities. That does not involve appeasing mom. It doesn't involve appeasing dad. It doesn't involve sacrificing your own sense of self or what resonates most with you because it's going to feel embarrassing to a parent or because it's going to make a parent feel that they've been usurped or anything like that. It is especially critical that as parents, we are willing to check our own egos. And I'm not talking about shaming ourselves. I'm talking about acknowledging what behaviors we bring forth that are ego-driven, checking them, and then choosing something different.
Yeah, just to reiterate what you said about, our responsibility as parents. Our responsibility as parents is to, exactly what you said, give them the moral guidance and direction to be a productive citizen on this planet that is willing to do the right thing, that knows what the right thing is, that knows that it's okay to be themselves, and that they are there to take care of themselves and look out for themselves and their family. But they're not there to make sure that mom's okay or dad's okay. Mm-hmm. They're not there, especially as children. They are not our keepers. They are not the people that are there to take care of us. We're there to take care of them, to keep them safe, to make sure that they learn the skills to move forward through their formative years and be able to function as a member of society and give back to society in a way that is constructive and provides value rather than only taking.
Exactly. Our kids are not responsible for our emotional edification.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about our role as step-parents. You're showing up every day, often without recognition. You're making dinners, showing up at the games, helping with homework, loving kids that aren't biologically yours, and yet you get told you don't count. Or worse, you get erased from the equation altogether. I have felt this firsthand. My husband's ex once tried to say that Anyone other than grandparents going on a field trip should be essentially cleared by her first. So let me translate that. Stepmom, you don't count. You're not valid enough to go. And it stung because here I am doing the day-to-day life alongside my stepson, being part of his routines, caring about his experiences, and suddenly I'm reduced to someone who needs permission to show up, or even an advanced warning to her. The fact is, my stepson's grandparents love and adore him and are consistently there for him. But guess who is there just as much as both bio mom and bio dad, even more than grandparents? Me. That's the reality of being a step parent. You can pour love in, treat the kids just as your own, and still be treated as invisible or irrelevant. Now let's connect this to ego. For the bio parent, it can feel like ownership. These are my kids. No one else gets to decide. That's their protector part, trying to hang on. But when that protector pushes you out, your own wounded part, which could very well be the exile, starts screaming, "See, you don't belong. You don't matter here." And that's why these conflicts cut so deep. It's not just about a field trip. It's about our deepest fears of rejection and not being enough. So now let's talk about what happens when those protectors and exiles start dancing. For example, when my daughter's bio dad found out that I had moved in with my now husband, he told me he shouldn't have to pay child support anymore. In his mind, because I had a husband now, his responsibility disappeared. That was very much his ego. That was his downright selfish side, looking for a way to skirt his responsibilities. So instead of owning his role, he tried to hand it off to benefit himself. He wasn't thinking about my daughter. He was thinking about alleviating a financial burden on him, and not by working harder or seeking a job with a greater amount of compensation, but by trying to manipulate to discard his responsibility. But here's where it got interesting, because my husband, instead of matching ego with ego, suggested something different. He said, "Fine, let him send the child support money directly to your daughter." And that response was rooted in the higher self energy. That was him stepping out of an ego fight and saying, "This isn't about who wins between parents. This is about what's best for the child." And although my ex was not happy about this, it worked. He began sending child support payments weekly directly to my daughter's bank account, and she was able to save substantially for college between this and working multiple jobs as well. But let's be honest, most of us don't land right there in that higher self space right away. Most of us flare up. Why? Because when our protector parts feel like they're losing control, the fight gets personal. And this is why in so many co-parenting conflicts, things spiral. It's not about logistics. It's about old wounds fighting for survival. And when you add complex PTSD into the mix, your brain and body don't just see today's conflict, they see every rejection, every betrayal, every abandonment you've ever lived through. And that's why these arguments feel like life or death, because for the nervous system, they are. So let's take a listen now to Chris and I taking this conversation a bit deeper and talking specifically about our own lived experience with these issues.
One other thing that I wanted to mention before I jump into that is all of the things you just mentioned. Another thing that we do really well as this co-parenting, step parents to each other's children and so forth is we're not afraid to have the challenging conversations with them either. Not only are we able to hold ourselves accountable, but we're not afraid to hold the other one accountable when they need to learn whatever lesson life is throwing at them at the moment. So that's one more thing that I wanted to throw out there before I delve into the question at hand. But some of the challenges that I think that we have faced as co-parents with their biological parents on the other side, there's a lot of assumptions that coming into a relationship with someone who has a child and they co-parent with their former significant other or their child's biological parent, I think some of those assumptions are that, one, things are going to be challenging at times. I think we hope for the best, but expect it to not go as smoothly as we'd like it to. But we never know what to expect. We never know how we're going to be received when we are introduced to that other person, or that other person discovers that their child has a new person in their life that's going to be around for a long time and is going to help raise them. I was extremely surprised to see how Willow's biological dad interacted with her. Not just interacted, but the way that he was supposedly there for her at times, and the ways that he very much was dropping the ball, and the way that those challenges that, or those experiences that she experienced with him, were harming her. Those things were tough to see. I've had less interaction with Willow's dad than you have with Harrison's mom. What little interaction I've had with him has been very surface level. There's not been any real conversations about parenting. It's really about just acknowledging each other's existence briefly before moving on to whatever we were doing that day. Where with Harrison and his mom, he's much younger. There's a whole lot more parenting that has to take place. And there's a whole lot more involvement by the parents for a child of 6, 7, 8 years old than there is for someone that's 15, 16, 17 years old. And so one of the things that I didn't anticipate as Harrison's dad introducing someone into his life was the level of resistance that we were met with from Harrison's mom. I think that I had this picture perfect idea that as long as we met each other in a respectful way and had respectful conversations, that it would be reciprocated. And I think that's not always the case. I think there is some things that we have run into where the challenges that we faced with Harrison, he needed representation from not just both bio parents, but both homes, which includes step parents and step siblings at times. And in those situations, your input has not necessarily been received well, not wanted to be included. Early on, there were definitely a lot of efforts to exclude you as someone who is going to be in Harrison's life, as if you were going to be around long term. And I think that resistance took and has taken a lot longer to die off than what I ever would have imagined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think going back to the dynamic that you described with Willow, just as an example, I'm sure that that was very surprising because you do have a very different parenting style. You know, you are extremely involved, of course, in Harrison's life, but also it has been very evident that it is very meaningful for you to be involved in Willow's life as well. And I'm sure it was very surprising to witness firsthand a lot of the ways that that was not happening from her bio dad. And I think that, you know, as it relates to the challenges that we experienced with Harrison's mom, I think part of what we noticed is that that resistance very much showed up as an effort to control my level of involvement. And one of the examples early on was when I accompanied him on a field trip. And instead of that being seen as something that was a positive effort on my side, it was stated that going forward, anyone other than grandparents, she should know about. And that was something that didn't make sense for a couple of reasons. For one thing, being your partner, being as involved in his life as you are, and even as she is, since you do have 50-50 custody, of course I would be involved even more than grandparents. And so, that was something that very much made me feel that I was not welcome and that the efforts that I was putting into the relationship with Harrison was going to be even more challenging because that loyalty bind was going to be even more difficult to navigate, having that type of attitude about the situation at hand. And I know that also put you in a difficult position as well, because you are very much wired to be a peacekeeper and to want to make sure that things are not difficult and that, there's not a lot of attitude or what have you. And so your approach to handling some of those instances wasn't necessarily reflective of honoring the fact that I am just as much a part of this blended family as anybody else would be as it relates to the kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Early on, it was new to me to navigate a new relationship after becoming a parent. It was not something that I had ever had to do as far as transitioning from one relationship to another in a sense that there was a child involved. So now that I'm no longer married to this person, I am bringing this new person into my life, and that person is going to have a lot of face time and a lot of experience, a lot of exposure to, at that time, my son, right? I trusted you very early on. I knew exactly where we were going. I knew exactly the trajectory of our relationship. It wasn't something where I introduced you day one to Harrison. There was quite a bit of time between when you and I met and when we introduced Harrison. Same with the way when I was introduced to Willow. And I trusted you, and I knew I could trust you. I think part of that was there wasn't a lot of time between those relationships to where, even though that relationship was closed out, I don't think that there was enough closure on one side. So that I think that created an additional
You
level
say
of
on
resistance.
one side, and sorry to interrupt you, but you say on one side. Could you clarify?
Yeah, there wasn't
that
enough
point?
closure on her side as Harrison's mom. That relationship ended rather than just accepting that it was over, which we both very much knew it was. The fact that I moved on as fast as I did probably hit a chord, because I'm sure there's some level of self-doubt around that, right? There's some level of, how did he move on so fast? So me moving on, I didn't look back because I knew what I wanted. I knew when I met you exactly what I wanted. And you and I took off very quickly. And within that, we built a very strong relationship quickly. And that relationship turned into something much more serious than just a dating relationship very quickly. And that, I think, is perceived as a threat to a mother. I also think that you being so involved and wanting to be so involved also poses what can be perceived as a threat to a mother, where it really should be perceived as, oh, this is a great thing for the child. Now he has an additional reliable, respectable, dependable person in his life. As she put it to us on at least one occasion, she felt like there was an effort to replace her, or as she put it, usurp her. And I
Yeah.
don't think that that goes back to the same incident of going on a field trip without getting her permission. Well, he was already living with us at this time. You and I were living together. He was spending 50% of his time there. It's not like this was just some individual that he had hardly even met. At this point, we were all building our family within that home. And this wasn't some random person that I decided to send on a field trip with my son. This
Right.
was his very soon to be stepmother within a couple of months of that specific incident. And so, yeah, I think for me, I'd heard absurd things like that from her in previous experiences before you and I had met, while I was still in that relationship, to where to me, it's an eye roll and I shrug it off and I move on. But I didn't really get the dynamic of how it would affect you. And so, and my response to her is, whatever you say, I'm shrugging it off. I'm blowing it off because you don't tell me how to, what I'm allowed to do with my son. You don't tell me who I'm allowed to bring my son around. You certainly don't tell me that my son's very soon to be stepmother isn't allowed to go on field trips with him. So I shrug it off, just, yeah, okay, send the message and I move on. And I think when I shared that with you, you didn't see it as a shrug off. You saw it as me just giving into her, appeasing her.
Right.
And there's probably something to that appeasing in that I didn't want to deal with the argument, but that also doesn't necessarily mean that I plan on actually going along with such an absurd request.
Mm-hmm.
It's more along the lines of, I don't have the energy to argue about this, so I'm just going to tell you okay, and I'm going to move on. And that was a very common dynamic in that relationship, where you and I will actually have conversations, sometimes for hours and hours and hours on end. And we're willing to work through those things and talk through those things. But I didn't owe that to her anymore. I didn't owe her anything beyond making sure that our child is safe when he's with us and making sure that she's doing the same when he's with her. And beyond that, there was no tie. There was no, I have to adhere to what you say. It's more of a, come on, let's be a little bit more mindful of what we're discussing and what's being asked of one another. We've run into that a number of times since then. Sometimes they're mild annoyances, and other times they're extremely frustrating. And those more frustrating situations are really hard to navigate.
Mm-hmm. They are. And I think that also sheds light on the need for boundaries. In our last episode, we talked about boundaries within step parenting directly. I also think that it is very important to acknowledge the boundaries that do need to occur with the expectations of everyone involved in a blended family dynamic. And that very much does include what those expectations from bio parents are of step parents, just as it would be from those expectations of step parents as it relates to bio parents. There has to be able to be some common ground. One party doesn't get to step forward and say, well, I run the show just because of my biology necessarily, when there is very significant involvement from all parties involved in raising the kid and doing what's best for the kid. And I think where part of the frustration for me came in early on is that just by virtue of who I was in relation to you, and then who I was in relation to Harrison, that was just automatically rejected. And the boundary around that for me is I understand that we don't have any control over what she says or what she does, just as we don't have any control over what Willow's dad says or does, but we absolutely have control over how we respond to it and how we honor each other and our family unit as something that is stable and sovereign in our responses to ludicrous requests such as that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing to keep in mind is it's not just how we respond, but is it even worth responding to?
Mm-hmm.
There's so many times it's so easy to get frustrated with how someone else communicates to you or about you. And that frustration may come in as something that very much you want to respond to, but is it worth the time? Is it worth the energy? Is it worth letting it disrupt in a way the things that, how we're feeling that day, or even our overall attitude? Is it worth letting us be put off by someone else's actions?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, absolutely. Sometimes it's absolutely worth it. Other times, not so much. And I think where you and I differ is when those things are, whether or not to allow those things to affect us. And I understand where you're coming from a lot of times, but other times you and I very much don't understand where we're coming from. We have some very challenging conversations around these topics because we have different outlooks on these specific events.
Mm-hmm. I think in part that's because, and this isn't necessarily a generalized statement because, of course, there are exceptions to what I'm about to say, but in part, you have a personality that is wired to be more passive and to, just as you gave the example of when the conversation around the field trip came up and you responded with, basically saying, well, whatever you say. And knowing that that wasn't actually going to be what would happen. But for me, I very much had the expectation that it was going to be called out that that was a ludicrous ask. And that's because I have a much more assertive personality. And for me, that very much comes from my own core of having to make sure that my presence is known because that wasn't safe for me growing up. So I have had to learn that if someone is trying to push me into the shadows, I have every right to step even more brighter into the light. And that is very much how I've always operated. And so the dynamic, as you said, that you had even when you were in a relationship with her, as being more passive and having more of a, oh, whatever you say, I roll type of response than going on and doing your thing. With me, it has been much more assertive. Like if Willow's dad has ticked me off over something, then he's going to know about it. And he's going to know that this is not okay. And I'm not going to put up with this. And I do agree with you that picking your battles is important. You can't let, especially when you have people in your life that, because of your children are very much going to continue to be a part of your life in some way for years to come. I understand you can't let every single annoyance become like a big fiery event. There are certainly annoyances when it comes to dismissiveness and disregarding and downright disrespect that absolutely need to be called out, if for nothing else, for the person to be able to honor their own position and to be able to honor their own involvement. Regardless, so like speaking up isn't about, going back to this example, right? Speaking up is not about necessarily trying to change the other person's mind or even trying to change their behavior. It is an acknowledgement of, you said something that is absolutely ludicrous. It comes from your own insecurities. It comes from your own ego. And I'm not going to do anything different because there's nothing different for me to do in this instance.
Absolutely. There are absolutely times where it is necessary to speak up, stand your ground, make sure that it's very much seen that you're not going anywhere. You're not going to be controlled. You're not going to be shunned. You're not going to be pushed out. That's hands down. Everybody has a right to defend their place in their children's lives, their stepchildren's lives, and so forth. What I know is that you have built an amazing relationship with Harrison. And in doing so, we've been able to lessen the impact of the things that we hear from his mom or from through him that we know that his mom may or may not have said or may not have alluded to, whether he was supposed to hear it or just happened to pick up on a vibe or whatever. We absolutely know that what you have with Harrison is much stronger than any doubt that someone else could put in his mind about it, because you're consistent. You are compassionate. You are playful with him. You are engaging. You are supportive. You teach him things. You hold him accountable. And I think that people, when you hold them accountable, especially children, when you hold them accountable, it may not feel good in the moment, but it lets them know that you're there even in the hard times, and that's not something to be afraid of.
Right.
And you do a good job of that with him and Willow about holding them accountable in those situations. And we know that you have built a very strong relationship with Harrison. And I think that every time we see him, we see how much more bonded he is to you. Now, we still have issues with certain transitions where He may not have the best day on transition day. So a lot of times after he's been gone for almost a week, those couple of days, the first day or two can absolutely be a little bit more challenging. But the majority of that time is absolutely 100%. He is excited. He's happy to be in the house. He's happy to be home. He's happy to be here with the pets and have his family time with all of us, including you, Willow, the pets, myself. He is very much loving and enjoying the family dynamic he has when he is with us.
Absolutely.
Hey, real quick, I've got something for you. If trust in your relationships has ever felt impossible, I know what it's like to want connection but feel scared to let anyone in. And that's why I created the Trust Blueprint. It's a trauma-informed guide to help you rebuild trust, set boundaries, and show up fully in your relationships. And this isn't just for you. Supportive partners will learn how to meet you where you are with patience, compassion, and understanding. Real healing doesn't happen alone. It happens together. The Trust Blueprint. Rebuild trust, reconnect with love, and start feeling safe again. Visit traumatopurpose.com and click on the Self-Paced Learning tab to learn more and get your download today.
New Vitamin Water Zero Sugar Pineapple Passion Fruit is packed with vitamins, just like the amount of peas we packed in that sentence. It's packed like your tote bag, the one you stole from your ex, or your overpriced half a studio apartment, or extra rushed rush hour traffic. Packed like your calendar, triple booked at 5, of course. Grab a vitamin water. Did we mention it's packed with vitamins?
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? But with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers, a network of 130 million of them, in fact. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills, and did I say job title? See how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Here's the paradox of being a step parent. You matter immensely, and yet you might never get the validation you deserve. Take another example from my life. My husband's ex refused to include me in therapeutic conversations about my stepson, even though the very conflict he may have benefited from processing in therapy had to do with me as a relatively new parental figure in his life. His inner conflict around loyalty binds needed to be heard and processed with all parental figures. But her intention was to exclude me completely from that equation. Think about that. How can a child work through an inner conflict if the adult at the center of it isn't even allowed a seat at the table? That exclusion wasn't about what was best for my stepson. It was about control. It was about ego. And even better, her intention seemed more rooted in her own challenges with accepting me than his struggles that she likely was contributing to. And in that moment, my exile part wanted to scream. I wanted to scream, I matter. Don't you dare try to erase me. But here's the thing. I have had to learn to not wait for validation from her. I've had to learn to anchor myself in my why. I love this child. I'm here because I choose to show up. And that is enough. And step parents, I want you to hear this. Your worth doesn't hinge on a bio parent's acknowledgement. Your worth is rooted in the love and consistency you bring, even if it takes years for the kids to recognize it, even if an ex never does. You're still leaving an imprint that matters. Now, let me speak as a bio mom for a minute, because obviously I'm on that side too. There are times when you absolutely have every right, even a responsibility, to set firm boundaries around who is around your child. And I'll give you an example from my own life. Years ago, my ex was dating a woman who thought it would be funny to teach my then 7-year-old daughter how to do shots. Now, they were shots with Sprite, but still, lining them up, teaching her to knock them back. She was 7. And as her mom, I was furious. That was a hard line for me. I had every reason to say, this person does not need to be around my child. That's not ego, that's protection. That's me acting as a parent to make sure my daughter's environment is safe. But here's where we have to make that distinction, because sometimes the concern is real, like in that story. But sometimes the concern isn't about safety at all. It's about ego and our own wounds. If the problem is that a step-parent is showing up as a genuine force for good in your child's life, loving them, supporting them, helping to raise them, then the issue isn't the step-parent. The issue is you. The issue is your ego, your wounded part that hasn't healed the fear of being replaced. And if you're the bio parent in that situation, you owe it to your kids to do the inner work, because pushing away a healthy and loving influence in your child's life isn't protecting them, it's depriving them. So yes, draw hard lines when it's about safety, values, or inappropriate behavior. But when it's about jealousy, fear, or your own unhealed wounds, your own insecurities, well, that's where the work is yours to do. Now let's flip it to the bio parent inside the blended unit. If you're that bio parent in a remarriage, your role is critical. You set the tone for whether your partner, the step parent, is seen as valid to the kids and also to your ex. I'll give you another concrete example. There was a time when my husband's ex refused to coordinate with me directly when it came to arranging for my daughter to pick up my stepson. She said she would only coordinate that time with my husband. Now, if my husband had gone along with that, what would that have communicated? That I was secondary, that I wasn't a real parental figure worth engaging with. But here's what he did instead. He stood with me. He stood beside me. And he said, no, Donna should be able to be the one to coordinate this. You should be able to work with her directly. And that's what it looks like when a bio parent protects their partner's credibility. That's what it looks like to say, we are a team, and I won't let you undermine her role. Bio parents, listen to me. Your partner's credibility is in your hands. And if you don't validate them, your kids won't either. If you let an ex dictate the rules of engagement, your home will always be divided. But if you stand united, your kids will learn what healthy partnership looks like, even in a blended family. So, what can you say about the challenges we've had with that, but also what we have learned to be a more effective and agreeable stance between us?
I'll be honest, from a scenario where Willow's dad has been involved, I don't know that he's ever been involved enough for me to be invalidated. It's a matter of very much just, hey, Chris is doing this, so I don't have to.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, and, unfortunately, Willow has definitely felt the burn of that her entire life, pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, right down to when we first moved in together, him saying that, well, now that I'm living with you, not us living together, but as he put it, me living with you, he shouldn't have to pay child support any longer. And I think you had a very positive reaction to that. And that, you know what, you and I, we were doing well. We were comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So Willow certainly wasn't going to feel any burn if he wasn't sending me money directly. And so you having him direct that directly to Willow, I think that was a very brilliant move. It was very much your way of saying that he doesn't get to get out of his responsibility to Willow. But at the same time, it's not something we need to benefit from.
Absolutely. Some of the things that you had shared with me leading up to that point was very much him posting pictures of her on Facebook and taking credit for his amazing daughter. and all the things that she's accomplished while never really being engaged or involved with the actual work it took to get her there.
Right.
And so with this one, it was an opportunity to kind of flip that a little bit, right? He didn't want to have to pay you child support anymore, which from what you've told me wasn't the most consistent anyway.
Exactly.
While putting that onus on him paying her, she would see just how inconsistent that was. And what we saw was a much more consistent payment to her directly.
Exactly.
Which was...
Then she had visibility to it.
Exactly. And it wasn't even a matter of her having to or needing to see that so much as just, it's almost a bit of a psychological trick. Well, if she's going to be involved, then now I have to let her see that I care a little bit more. So I have to be a little bit more, I have to make more effort. Right. And so it kind of put the onus on him to show how much he wants to support her and how little he wants to support her. And that continued very consistently until right up to the day that she turned 18.
Exactly. And to that point as well, I think that is something that we all can really reflect on as parents, regardless of what type of parental role that is. And that we certainly never want stresses between adults to be felt by our kids. But there does very much come a time in our kids' lives, especially as they are older, that they recognize that. They recognize a lack of involvement. They recognize an overbearing nature. They recognize people trying to poison them against other people. They may not in the moment that it's happening, especially if it's happening when they're younger, but in time, they do recognize that. And it is important to be a safe adult, to be able to see that yourself and not put that burden on your kid, but be able to protect your kid by guiding the interactions in such a way that the other parent's choices inevitably are seen for what they are, because that helps to dilute the manipulative efforts that a lot of parents that very much operate from their own ego instead of operating from a self-accountable place that they bring, because it can have devastating long-term impacts to the kids.
Absolutely. And to deviate a little bit from this specific situation, I often reflect when we're talking about parenting and how we parent, I often reflect on stories that I've heard from my mom over the years. And one of the things that used to upset her so much is very similar to what we've expressed about how Willow's dad has been with her and with you. My dad wasn't the most consistent with things either. And that was frustrating enough for my mom. But what was really frustrating is that the special occasions, that's when he would swoop in and be the hero. And he would swoop in at Christmas time and have all these gifts. He'd swoop in at birthdays and have all these gifts. And then he was gone. And there was no responsibility around it. He'd just drop off what he could drop off and then
disappear.
Yeah, he did. There was no parenting with that. It was, hey, look, I'm here too. Let me give you all these things. And then that way you see that I'm involved. And again, I mentioned this last time, I really care deeply for my dad. He was a genuinely good person, didn't have a good parental skill set.
Yeah.
And didn't have it in him to stay involved. He was more worried about his other goals in life. And I think we have seen similar behaviors in how Willow's dad is with her. I think that particular career choice tends to have a more focus on what can I do to thrive and excel than what can I do to make sure that my family thrives.
Exactly. And because it's based on individual attention.
Right.
And so for those who are listening, when we say particular career choice, we're basically talking about artistic expressions. And of course, this is not to say that anyone that's a musician or an artist doesn't have it in them to be a family-oriented person at all. But there can be, and I mean, this is firsthand experience for both of us, there absolutely can be a tendency to be much more focused on the perceived glory that comes from being a performer and getting attention in that way, instead of there being fulfillment of one's sense of self from being more a contributor to the collective, a
Right.
contributor to their family. And there is a large ego involvement a lot of times. Again, not saying every time, but, in our unique experiences in that realm, that has very much been present.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can say I've seen the other side of that with
Mhm.
musicians and people and the different types of arts, where it's not their primary focus. It's a
Right.
big focus and they
Mhm.
care a lot about it, but it doesn't overshadow their family life, or it doesn't overshadow their responsibilities to their family.
Right. They're able to
There's
find
a
that balance
between the two.
Exactly. Yeah. And that balance is very important.
Going back to your question, and let me make sure I reiterate the question properly so I answer it properly. But what I think you were asking in that moment was, what are some times where you were overshadowed or cast out as far as the conversation, and what was done to make sure that you were validated and that your position in the conversation had validity, and that what you had to say, even as not necessarily as a bio parent, still had value to the conversation.
Mhm.
So we've definitely had our struggles with this early on. Again, this goes a lot to my peacekeeping mentality of trying to balance between a new relationship and a relationship that was gone and over, but also had to be maintained from a co-parenting standpoint, where early on it was challenging. It was tough for me as someone who wants to keep the peace to just say, no, that's a ludicrous ask and we're not going to listen to you. To me, it was easier to, in some way, acknowledge what was said in an appeasing way, knowing that you and I were going to do what we needed to do co-parent when Harrison was with us.
Mhm.
You made it very obvious early on that, for one, you weren't going to tolerate that. And two, that it wasn't a healthy way of handling the situation.
Right.
And I have very much learned how to be more assertive in those conversations from you. But it's not just about being more assertive. It's about doing what's right rather than just making sure somebody doesn't get their feelings hurt along the way.
Exactly.
And when someone tries to exclude you from a communication thread or a decision that's being made about someone that you are helping to raise, that's not right. Your input is just as valid as mine. And you and I are going to have a general consensus before we even engage in the conversation with her.
Mhm.
So by not willing to include you in the initial conversation to begin with, doesn't keep your input out of it. It just makes sure that she doesn't have to be engaging with you. And that's appeasing to her. So we try to push back on that. We try to make sure that you are in those conversations, because we know that there's got to be some level of pushback. We may not get a different response from her. We may continue to get the same avoidant tactics of, well, I can't communicate with her because whatever she perceives as a threat, or that you're doing something in a way that is going to make her look bad. But the only thing in those situations that is going to make her look bad is her own tactics, her own
Mhm.
way of approaching the conversation. We are trying to do what's best for Harrison.
Mhm.
And what's best for Harrison is giving a full holistic point of view about whatever the topic is.
Right, exactly. And, a couple of additional points to that as well. For one thing, I think that it is the healthiest scenario that I can think of would be that Harrison would be able to see that his bio mom, his bio dad, and his stepmom, and, if she ends up getting into a long-term relationship and remarries or what have you, that stepfather, what have you, are able to all come together and have a conversation where they are working through something to be in his best interest, and that there isn't an effort of exclusion from any of that. And that has not been something that we have been able to reach present day. And again, I understand that you can't force somebody's hand at something. You don't owe it. And when I say you, obviously we've already had these conversations. I'm not drilling this in, but people also don't owe it to another person to spare their feelings and be appeasing when it is obviously their ego that is trying to run the show. Because what that does is invalidate the presence of the other parent that is showing up and that is doing things consistently to try to care for the child, care for the family as a whole. There has to be able to be that balance across the board. Efforts to exclude ultimately injure the child on an emotional level, and it causes unnecessary friction that further exasperates that.
Absolutely. One of the things that we have experienced with Harrison at times, and we don't know exactly what's going on or what has happened to cause, but we see where he can be withdrawn. If all three of us are in the same space with him, he can be withdrawn. And it seems like as soon as he gets us to himself or gets his mom to himself, that withdrawn trait or personality trait is very much lifted. He doesn't feel like he has to repress his feelings, his emotions, his joy of being around the people that he loves. But we do see that when we're all together, he goes much more into a reserved state. He's less enthusiastic. He's less energetic. And within minutes of parting ways and going our way with Harrison or Harrison going with his mom, you can even see them as they're walking out that he's already more energetic. And same with us. When we leave and she's going her way, that he gets energetic before we even leave the space. It's just like there's this pressure there that he feels like if he makes a wrong move somehow, that there is something that's going to upset someone.
We saw that at his baseball games. We would show up at his baseball games, and if it was a night that he would be going home with his mom that evening or what have you, he wouldn't want to hug us. He wouldn't want to acknowledge us when we were waving at him or, trying to have conversation or what have you.
Yeah.
And that is something that was addressed. But you could tell there was a huge amount of inner conflict there it almost felt like, well, you can't let her see that I'm excited about seeing Dad and Donna or, what have you. And it does. It restricts his ability to feel safe in his own expression.
And in a space where he is around the people that care for him the most. And that includes you. You love him like he is your own child, just as I love Willow as she is my own child. And for him to feel like he can't be his expressive self when all three of us, including you, me, and his mom, in the same space, it raises alarms. It raises concerns that he is not able to be his true self, and he should never feel that way. And we are doing everything we can that we know how to do to make sure he knows that it's okay to be himself no matter what, and that to be affectionate with whoever he wants to within the space. There's no us versus her. It's very much if you want to spend time with your mom, have at it. If you want to spend time with us, we always want you around.
Right.
We always try to make sure that he knows it's okay for him to reach out to his mom if he wants to FaceTime with her. And he's got his own electronics. He can do that in the comfort of his room where he can have his privacy. They can talk about whatever they want to. And vice versa. And I think that it's important that he knows that he can do that anytime that makes sense. Obviously, you don't want to be making calls at 2:00 in the morning, but when it's a normal time in which a conversation should be happening, reach out, tell her you miss her, tell her you love her, and feel free to do the same with us.
Yeah. So, how do we stop letting these battles destroy us? Well, that's where the internal family systems comes in. Because every time a step parent is excluded and every time a bio parent feels threatened, those are the parts that are at war. So next time you feel that flare, pause, name the part. This is my protector. This is my firefighter. This is my exile. For me, when I was excluded from those therapeutic conversations, it was my exile, my part that knows what it feels like to be dismissed and silenced, that started screaming. And instead of shoving it down or exploding, I had to stop and thank it. Hey, exile, I see you. Thank you for reminding me how much I value being included. Thank you for fighting for me. And that small act softens the intensity. And once the part softens, I can step back into that higher self space where I feel that sense of calm and compassion. And I become the grounded leader that's always there inside of me. And from there, the question isn't, how do I win this fight? It's, what does my stepson need right now? What does my daughter need right now? That shift from ego to self is everything. And here's where I want to leave you, because this is the heart of it. When you've lived through trauma, these blended family conflicts will feel bigger than they are. Not because you're dramatic, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system has been trained to see danger where there is disconnection. So when a bio parent excludes you, it's not just about today. Your body remembers every time you were excluded before, every time you were told you weren't enough, every time you were abandoned, whether physically or emotionally. And that's why these moments feel like survival. But healing is possible. The more you recognize the hijack, the quicker you can come back to your higher self. The quicker you can come back, the less damage your kids absorb. And that's the legacy we're building here. Not perfect families, not pain-free families, but resilient families. Families where kids see adults working through conflict without destroying each other. Families where step parents and bio parents learn to check their egos and lead from love instead of fear. So let's wrap this up. Step parents, you're not invisible. Bio parents, you hold the power to validate your partner and create unity. Together, you can either let your wounded parts run the show, or you can choose to lead from yourself, that higher self. Your kids don't need perfect parents. They need parents who are brave enough to face their own triggers, their egos, their exiles, and choose compassion anyway. So we've talked in this series about being accountable as parents in all the ways. But what if it's the legal system and government officials that are turning a blind eye to kids' well-being? On our next episode of The Last Generation, I'm going to share with you some shocking data we discovered right here in my home state of Kentucky that identifies officials violating the law and allowing children to marry, in some cases, to adults so much older, the relationship itself is a statutory rape offense. But for today, take this with you from our Parenting on Broken Ground series. Love in blended families doesn't look traditional. It looks chosen. It looks steady. It looks like showing up even when it's hard. And that's what breaks cycles and builds new legacies, just like showing up to stand up to broken systems. I'll see you next time on The Last Generation. You've been listening to The Last Generation, transforming trauma into purpose. For more resources, visit traumatopurpose.com. If this episode resonated with you, consider leaving a review and joining the community online. Subscribe, and let's transform together.
This podcast is part of the Sound Advice FM network. Sound Advice FM, women's voices amplified.